Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Contra Mundum. I am one of the hosts, Andrew Isker, and with me is my co-host, CJ Engel, and we're very pleased to introduce Lafayette Lee. Lafayette is an excellent poster and writes in many places. I Am 1776 is one of the places you can find his work. Tons of great articles and things that he's written. And welcome to the show, Lafayette Lee. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And yeah, before we recorded, CJ and I got to see his actual face, and he looks exactly like Clark Gable. So the avatar that he has really is basically a face dox anyway. So just so you all know, this is the first on the show. This is the first guest we've had that is not a face poster, and so just imagine Clark Gable behind that screen the entire time, and that's the guy. That's who we're talking to. Yes, exactly. And so we wanted to have Lafayette on today because we've talked multiple times, at least in passing, about the New Deal, about the middle of the 20th century, really the revolution that happened in America in the 20th century, and all of the things. I mean, all of things that I talk about, the CJ talks about trash world, about what we exist in now today, really has its genesis in 1933 with the New Deal and FDR and everything that came in during that time. And Lafayette, I think, is really the expert on this period of history. The one guy that I'm like, we got to have him on to talk about this stuff and really dive deep into what it is, what it means, because it's really an unknown part of American history. I went to public school. CJ, I think you were homeschooled, weren't you? Or you went to Christian school?
I was homeschooled, yeah.
But even within like the homeschool world, Christian school world, you still get kind of the court narrative of American history where, like, even if I talk to like older, boomer relatives, people I know, and I ones that are very conservative, Trump voters even, and I ask them, well, what do you think about FDR? What do you think about the New Deal? They'll speak about it positively. They'll be like, well, he was a Democrat, he was bad, but he helped the country out, and we won World War II because of him. He was a good president, and so even they will think highly of him and this time period, and that's a major problem. Like, we have to be able to understand actually what happened in order to address what's happening to us now. So what's so bad about the New Deal? What's so bad about this period, Lafayette, in your opinion?
No, it's a fascinating period of time, and I think really people that are critical of the present, I don't know how you can't really formulate much of an argument or understand what we're dealing with if you don't grapple with the New Deal. Now, I'm not going to come here and say that, like, I'm not a libertarian, and so I'm not going to come in and say, like the New Deal just specifically ruined everything. I kind of take a more historical perspective that in many ways the New Deal was responding to a real crisis. And I'm not just talking about the financial crisis in America. There was massive changes going on all throughout the world. So you can see this time period where you have the rise of, Bolshevism came before it. You have the rise of fascism in Europe, questions about, how do we deal with this? And then so in the United States, the United States is this place that we have always kind of charted our own course. We're different. We're strange. The Europeans look at us and they don't quite get it. And we look at them and we don't really quite get it either. They don't think we have much of a culture. We're still kind of like coming back from this frontier society. We've been a frontier society for most of our history. So like, we don't really have much, even though we have like these European roots and ties, we aren't really European altogether. And that's like really important to understand, because it isn't like you could just do a carbon copy of fascism or communism in America to respond to these same tensions and pressures that the rest of these countries are dealing with at that time, right? And so I think it's important, like, as much as I harangue communism and I believe it had a major impact on the United States. But I also think like some of the ideals and the ethos of fascism also had a lot of impact on America at this early stage, because we became kind of a catch-all for really good and bad ideas coming from Europe. And this was something that was, in the works for a very long time. Like communism came to America almost during the Civil War, right? So we have, or, the war between the states, whatever, but you know what I'm saying? So it's like, but you have, I mean, this ideology came over here earlier than people realize, that these things it found a foothold, but it was still kind of these were strange ideas. And America didn't really, America was always confident because we just are not Europe. We do not have the same. We don't have the same history. We don't have the limitations. We have a continent that we've tamed, right? So there's like so much. We have such a distance too. So that's important to kind of set up what the New Deal was and what it wasn't. Something that I want to get to though on the New Deal is the New Deal is not just like we look at it through an economic lens. We tend to kind of just compartmentalize events in history, look at it through a strictly economic lens I think the political lens is really important. And for some reason, as politically minded as we all are today, is we overlook this aspect of it. FDR was a political, like a really had a level of genius when it came to politics. He was an incredibly adept political operator. This guy knew how, and I mean, it's incredible. So and one other thing I want to say is when you look at the present, you get frustrated with how, let's say that you're angry because the Democrats pull, they pull these shenanigans and half of the population is still convinced that like these disastrous policies are really good. I mean, we're living in the shadow of this new America that came about in the 1930s, and it was a new America. Okay. Because these same shenanigans, as we'd say, but like these same political decisions and the propaganda and the ability to outfox your competition and to take on patronage, to crush, enemies, but also buy in allies. I mean, FDR perfected this during this time, and he was able to amass an incredible amount of power doing so. In many ways, created a one-party state. Okay, so sorry for all the digging, kind of digging around the foundations of this.
No, this is excellent. Yeah, it's excellent because it establishes really just how unique it was and how much of a radical departure it was. And even, I mean, when we talk about the uniparty or the regime today, I mean, that's what you're talking about here is it had its formation during this time period where, whether it's Democrat or Republican, there's this uniparty. I mean, even if you look at like Ukraine today, and Mitch McConnell is when he's actually able to speak, what he's saying is, oh, we need to have more money for Ukraine, and the entire Congress is like, yep, definitely. And so you see this kind of uniparty action, and it's part, it's the same thing that you're describing right here, that this one party state in America that he formed. I mean, would you agree with that? Is it really along the same lines?
Yeah, no, I think there's some incredible parallels that I think are just, they're so poignant. It kind of gives me goosebumps, sometimes when we start going through this, because like, if you think about it, so we do have like people call it the uniparty today. But yeah, this is very similar to that time period where you have an inner party and an outer party. The outer party, the only way that they can really wield any kind of power is by playing the game and basically agreeing to be the outer party. The authentic reaction to, or like genuine reaction to FDR, that's a true opposition, would be embodied by, strangely enough, America First. And so you have this America First movement. And how is America First dismantled? I mean, FDR was able to smear the entire operation as being proto-fascist, Nazis, anti-Semitic. So it's similar today. So people still, when I talk about America First, the original America First Committee, when you talk about everybody knows maybe Charles Lindbergh, even though he was not I mean, he was more of a figurehead, not
Yeah.
necessarily like a mover and shaker within the organization. Um, that's
Mhm.
what they'll always latch onto. What they're doing, and
Yeah.
I don't fault people for doing this, but they are hanging on to the leftovers, mostly of propaganda from that time period. If you dig
Yeah.
into the details, when you start actually reading about this moment in history, the rise and fall of that organization, I mean, it just it does not comport with the historical record as we know it. And so it's interesting that you see a rise of a Brown scare today. I mean, really,
Mhm.
the rise of Donald Trump
Yeah.
was the response was to gin up another Brown scare, very
Yeah.
similar to what happened with Roosevelt and his party and the opposition. And then also when it comes to war, that somehow the anti-war, the pro-pacifist, people who at least claim that mantle are now smearing people as being in the employ of a foreign power if they oppose
Mhm.
entry into another war, a proxy war. And this is exactly what happened in that time period. It's weird and it's funny. I can't take it seriously, and I think this is like one of the problems is that we're in this strange milieu where we're all kind of in
Yeah.
this weird place where we're outside of a party structure. We don't have much top cover, but like I can't take the narrative seriously because I know the narratives that came before. Like I know that I don't
Exactly.
hate one. I know that I don't like I mean I'm not like a Putinist. There's nothing
Mhm.
like that. But
Yeah.
but also the attacks just don't really have much teeth because to me, I mean, this is just it's a game. This is how it was
Yeah.
played in the past. It was effective in the past. So they're just doing it all over again. There are some true
Yeah.
believers, but for the most part, this is a cynical political game that is very old.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
What one thing I'll say just to kind of get back to the New Deal. Sorry if I'm like
Yeah.
monologuing. You can stop me.
No, no. This is
That's
perfect.
why you're here. Yeah.
You
That's
put a
right.
quarter in me, I can't stop. I'm like
Let's
that
go.
the horsey in front of Kmart. But I'll say, but I'll say that. So one thing I want people to kind of understand, in like at a large, kind of macro view here, when when FDR, so when FDR rose to power, there was this crisis point once he had won the election, and in between the inauguration and the election, there were some serious problems going on with the stock market. There was there was a lot of capital departure, like there was a lot of capital outflows from the United States, people hoarding their money and trying to send it abroad because this massive disaster was looming on the horizon. Okay,
Yeah.
so you kind of see this changing of the guard at this time. You have Herbert Hoover, who has been maligned throughout history. He was maligned in his
Yeah.
day, had everything pinned on him. He and his administration was scrambling to fix this problem, and they were trying. And I'm not saying this because I have like a partisan
Yeah.
affiliation, anything like that. I'm just trying to be accurate as possible. He had a very conservative approach. He wanted to protect the U.S. economy. He wanted to make sure that the money was not going to depart and make the matters worse. He knew that we were going to have to pass through a rough patch. He was hoping that we could minimize the damage, especially on regular folks. Okay, that was
Yeah.
something that was very important to them in that interim between the winning of Roosevelt's winning of the election and the inauguration. During this time, some disastrous news was coming into the White House. Uh, Hoover had a team assembled trying to fix this. He had people in the Treasury trying to work, with Wall Street trying to get this thing fixed. Um, there was panic though, and so what Hoover, if you think about this from a president's perspective, his street cred, his brand is very damaged because things are going
Mhm.
very poorly. What he wants to do is he wants to restore people's confidence because the worst thing that can happen during these bank runs is people panic, and this
Mhm.
makes things even deeper and even worse. So he has a plan, and he reaches out to Roosevelt because Roosevelt's going to be the incoming president. He's the new fresh face. He's kind of like the Obama walking into
Mhm.
financial crisis. He wants FDR. He sends him a telegram and he wants FDR to reassure people before, like immediately, before he takes the podium, before he gets sworn in. Please, would you please, like, here's our strategy, but we want to reassure people so that they keep their money in the system. We can't afford to have it exit the system or have people panic. We do not want more regional bank failures. And it would be a lot if the incoming president were to reassure people and tell them to just, hang tight. We're going to fix this. And what's really interesting, and this kind of just speaks to the way that Roosevelt is he got the telegram, his own campaign. I mean, they're all partying and having a great time. He gets the telegram, and his team is kind of like looking at him wide-eyed. This is serious. This is a big problem. Like, what are we going to do? And the expectation is, well, of course, like Roosevelt will want to, reassure people and save the system, help be part of that. Roosevelt got that telegram and stuck it in his desk, and then just kindly, smiled and went about his business and held on to it, did not respond for weeks. And so things are deepening, worsening. Hoover's wondering, like, where is Roosevelt, and they're still scrambling to try to address this. Things are getting worse. A lot of the things that he had predicted would happen are happening. And finally, like, he reaches back out to the campaign. And essentially what happens is FDR responds by saying, "Oh, I had sent a telegram back, but it must have been lost." And so essentially he just kind of hangs on to it until inauguration. Does not lift a finger. Okay.
Yeah.
And when he gets sworn in, it's this epic moment, right? And he gives this incredible speech where he declares a state of emergency and essentially says, like, we're going to fight this like we're going to fight a war. We're going to mobilize the population. I mean, and really, if you compare this to rhetoric in Europe at the time, it sounds very fascist. Okay. We're going to mobilize the population. This is going to be a militaristic attack on, this problem. And essentially in incoming weeks blames everything on his predecessor. The Republican Party has been, they are big spenders. They've been spending all this money, high levels of corruption, so on and so forth. The funny part, though, is that initially he comes in and there's this plan, and Hoover's people want to integrate this plan and to fix things. And what Roosevelt does is he adopts Hoover's plans exactly. And he pulls on people from Hoover's administration to address this crisis. But then he goes around and blames Hoover and says that there was no plan, that Hoover had no idea what, and it became this really powerful political moment where one of the reasons why Hoover is so dour in that picture that everybody knows when they're driving around in the uncovered vehicle, and FDR is all smiles and Hoover looks like he has a sour expression. It's because he knew he was getting played really bad. And he got played hard. Okay. So he goes out like a rail from Washington. And why I bring this up is this little snapshot that most people do not know, because when you actually start digging into the first several weeks of the New Deal, you can see that this is kind of the MO. This is the way that Roosevelt manages this crisis. It is not according to a plan. Roosevelt was not an economic genius. In fact, Roosevelt did not really, I'm saying this, I'm not saying Hoover necessarily knew better, but Roosevelt had no idea what he was doing in the beginning. It was very much a political move that had economic consequences throughout. Okay. That's kind of the New Deal. It's actually more of a political project than it is an economic one. And that people don't understand that. And that's where the lore, which you talked about with boomers, that's the lore, is that he brings in all these like whiz kids and smart people and professors, and they come in and they fix everything. But what it really was is this was political consolidation with economic components and pieces that people can identify with. So one last thing I'll say, sorry, and I'll catch my breath. Everybody interject, but the thing to recognize as somebody, we're Americans living in 2023, and we talk about the Constitution and we talk about, the assaults on our rights and all this, and we look back at 1776 like it was yesterday, and we wonder why things are so different. How do we get back there and all this? People have to realize, as there's these major changes within the U.S. economic system and our political system over the course of centuries. And as you get to FDR, the constitutional order was fragile at that point. And I
Hmm.
would argue my thesis here with FDR would be that he upended the constitutional order that was left. It was over after this. The New
Yeah.
Deal and the subsequent after the war, this was the end of the American constitutional order. I'm not saying that the Constitution does not exist, but I'm saying
Hmm.
it was really irreparably changed after this period of time. And there's a reason why things feel so out of sorts, why it doesn't line up. It feels so off
Hmm.
from where things were prior. The rhetoric is the same, but
Hmm.
the landscape is fundamentally different. That's my argument would be that Roosevelt upended the constitutional order, and we're living really in the aftermath of that. So, like
Yeah.
constitutional arguments and going back to the founders, you're kind of screaming into a void. I empathize with
Hmm.
that, but you have to grapple with the New Deal if you want to make those arguments.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people don't realize, the extent to which the New Deal changed everything. It also changed the Overton window in the sense that, like, conservatism, so-called conservatism, the right, the opposition to the
Mhm.
New Deal was in a completely different place before the New Deal, and that redefined it. Once you have the conservative movement, which was basically an artificial creation in the 50s and 60s, um, that was part of their operation, was not to go back and pursue some sort of Robert Taft, undoing
Mhm.
the effects of the New Deal, but it made a new starting point. You cannot in
Yeah.
public life anymore question what happened. This is the way American society is organized now, and anything before that is just ridiculous and silly and not worth anyone's time. The New Deal restructured America. It placed the sovereignty of the institutions in Washington and the bureaucracy. And it is it was the river that basically transitioned from, we have these old concepts of like the Constitutional Convention and popular sovereignty. Those things were given heavy blows in the progressive era, even in the Civil War. But in the New Deal, it basically created something, an entire new beast, and we could
Mhm.
never return to anything before that, legally. You would have to have another like revolution to undo the effects of the New Deal. It was that systemic. It was that hegemonic. And I don't think people realize the extent to which the New Deal changed everything, and it put us on a path toward, even things like the civil rights movement. We talk a lot about the civil rights regime, the new constitution that was created in the '60s. All of that could not have happened if it wasn't for the so-called managerial revolution that happened in the '30s.
I think man, that's very well said. I think that's exactly right. Is that this constitutional order that we recognize was very much replaced, and like people today will complain about Congress not doing anything. Congress is doing everything that Congress is allowed to do, which Congress is allowed to make money. Like that's really like they're allowed to fundraise, to pull in funds, make money, insider trading, all that, because they
Yeah.
were bought off long ago. If they were to flex their power, because this is the thing, is that the Constitution, like everybody likes to get into the details, and I think it's more useful to take more of like a first principles thing. The
Hmm.
the Constitution prior, this the war, Civil War changes things a lot, by the way. But moving past that, you still have somewhat of a constitutional order that is somewhat recognizable. I wouldn't say that the
Hmm.
American Republic exists the way that people say, but at the same time, the constitutional order is still there. What really changes after this, as we get closer, and as the New Deal comes along, and from the New Deal, you get like the war, I mean, the war making, the powers of the presidency change. Before this, you have legislative supremacy. So when
Right.
we talk about
Yeah.
co-equal branches of government, the way that the founders understood that wasn't that they were completely equal in power. The founders were in their day, it was just a given fact that that legislative supremacy was the way in which this would work. That the way that the
Yeah.
people's consent would be integrated into government would be through legislative supremacy. It got completely changed after this period of time. You do not have legislative supremacy. You don't have it today. A good example for those who might not understand that is if you look at Rand Paul uh, interrogating Anthony Fauci. Perfect example.
Yes.
we might like Rand. I like him. I think he's a decent fellow. I think he's one of
Yep.
the better ones in there. But notice who's in control during those exchanges. Yes, it is fun to get into this, this pomp and ceremony of this whole thing. It's fun to feel
Yeah.
excited when he goes after Fauci. This is what Congress does best. They are great performers. They put on an excellent show. They get some sound bites. They pull in donations or whatever. But like, who's in control here? It's Anthony Fauci. Who's asking
Yeah.
the question of whom? You have a ceremonial figure who's given their 5 minutes of fame to talk to power, to talk to arbitrary power, to talk to the operational side of the US government, which is in control, right?
Yeah.
One has power, one has authority. So Congress supposedly has authority, but they do not have power. And their power was really, it was sold off long before any of these guys showed up. I'm not trying to let them off the hook, but at the same time, when Roosevelt came in, and it wasn't just Roosevelt. I mean, a lot of change happened between now and the 1930s, but this really got set into stone at that time. Roosevelt was able to buy off Congress. He bought off Congress through these policies, this profligate spending. I mean, it's interesting because when he came in, he was attacking Hoover for being a big spender. That was his thing.
Yeah.
He actually, the New Deal was couched as like a economically conservative plan. I mean, it really resonated. Yeah. Democrats were fairly conservative, especially in the South. So you have a lot of people that are really, okay, I like this. Like, the reason why we're here is because they were so like spend happy, and he's able to cement that in people's minds as a narrative. And then he spent more money within the next 5 years than all the US presidents, including Hoover, combined, right? And this is how he buys off Congress, and this has been the way things are ever since.
I just want to echo that, because that's what I was referring to when I mentioned the popular sovereignty. I mean, before any bureaucracy or agency, all of those things were accumulating power, but they were still had a dynamic of subservience to the legislative powers. And in that situation, you do have someone like who would be analogous to a Fauci. They would be scared of someone like Rand Paul, because they knew that in the legislature lied the power of the people. Everything switched after that. And when you have something where a bureaucracy is supposedly reporting to Rand Paul, who's sitting up there, overlooking him, what you're really seeing is like it's fun and it's exciting because we all hate Fauci, but Rand Paul's actually not exercising any power. Fauci is not scared. His position is not in jeopardy. The power of the U.S. administrative state is not in jeopardy. It is performative. It's fun. It gets lots of views. People get excited, but there's no power dynamics going on in the way we think they are. He's not scared of Rand Paul. Rand Paul could be just easily destroyed by the people the interests that Fauci represents. And I think that easily explains the switch of dynamic really clearly.
Yeah. There's nothing he can do to him. What can Rand Paul on his own ever do to him? Nothing. Or even the Republican Party. Like, there's not, they can call a committee and do more investigations, but those never go anywhere.
And this is what the administrative state was. It claimed sovereignty. It's the thing that stole sovereignty, and the legislative branch became performative. It became like a sort of a pacifier for the masses in Middle America, especially, that they thought they would have representation in Washington, but all of that ended effectively in terms of power in the New Deal.
Yeah, where I live, in particular, like it's hard for people to comprehend this. Like, where I live in the 1st District of Minnesota. That's my congressional district, and it's very rural. And whoever gets elected, usually it's a Republican, but sometimes we have Democrats. And whoever is elected, his priority, his main reason for being in Congress is to ensure that farmers get all the subsidies that exist, and to keep the spigot of money flowing to them. And that's not by accident. And you look at other congressional districts; they'll have a military base or some large military industrial complex, a factory there, and that's what drives things. Every single congressional district is plotted out where their particular subsidies that they have to defend. And that's the reason for existence. I mean, as a congressman is
Mhm.
is that particular thing. And so that's how they have them. And that has its origin in this time period where you didn't
Mhm.
have these massive subsidies that so you look at like my congressman Brad Finstead, supposed to be this big MAGA guy, but really behind his name shouldn't say R, it should say, Cargill or Monsanto, right? That's who he represents, because that's the economic interest that drives our entire region. And so you multiply that across 435 plus 100 senators, and that's what Congress is today. They're just figureheads who keep the flow of largesse going into their particular areas. And that's how we have to understand what Congress is, and the major change. Because before that, he would be able to be independent. He would be able to actually represent his people and their particular interests of what they believe and what matters to them. And now that's gone, completely gone. And so I wanted to get into the Fauci thing a little bit more, and just this dynamic between the administrative state, the managerial state, whatever we want to call it, that's ushered in the New Deal, because you had a presidency that from 2017 to 2021 that was not aligned, at least entirely, with the administrative state. And so you see this like with COVID. And the thing that people and there's plenty of things to criticize Trump that I think we're all agreed here that the mistakes that he made and so forth during COVID. Um, but I look at most people look at it as though like he's in control of the government, and he's in control of Fauci and control of all of these things because he's the executive. And that simply isn't the case, right? Fauci is in control of him more than the other way around, right? I mean, so am I right there? Unpack that for me, Lafayette and CJ. I mean, is that accurate to say when we analyze COVID through this lens?
Well, yeah, that's the thing is like it. I'm pretty easy on Trump for the most part. I mean, because like we have to realize like I also have problems with policies,
Yeah,
policy, but we have to remember that the president of the United States, it's the people around him. It's
yeah,
who can pull these levers, who can wield power, who can twist arms the right way. Notice how quickly things move with Biden. Is it because Biden
yeah,
is a big policymaker? Is it because he has great leadership? Now, what he brings to the table is he's a creature of Washington and he has powerful relationships. So that's true. He does
mm-hmm.
have those things. But he has people behind him that are
Mm-hmm.
that know what they're doing. Okay? They are able to flex the administrative state in a way that gets things done for the people that they represent and serve, which are not necessarily the American people, right? We all know this, but this is the thing: is like the president when he's operating against a hostile administrative state. Like let's look back into history in the 20th century and see what happened to presidents that crossed that line. I would
Yeah,
argue JFK crossed that line, Nixon crossed
mm-hmm.
that line.
Yeah,
So, and people have their theories on what happened and why. I would argue that both of those presidents suffered dire consequences for crossing a line. Okay. And I don't think that needs to be necessarily like some, people will say there's a conspiracy behind. Like, really, what it is that JFK was directly challenging the Department of Defense in a way, and other agencies in government in a way that was not expected, and it caused a lot of internal turmoil.
yeah,
Nixon had ambitions to wield the administrative state in a different way. He also had ambitions to go against the consensus on some of the policies that the administrative state was very invested in, that factions within the administrative state. And this is the thing is, it's not Democrat, like let's transcend Democrats and Republicans. That's kind of a
mm-hmm.
congressional thing. That's part of the performance art. But like
Yeah,
the administrative state is full of powerful factions, and powerful factions that do compete against one another, whether they're both liberal factions within. I mean, you have to realize, like, what Biden's bringing in is going to be like, these are not the same. They have overlapping interests with some of the same players from like the Never Trump types that, were holdovers from Bush. Obviously, they both like war and all those things like that, but these are different factions within the administrative state that are competing against one another. It like the
Yeah.
political lens we have is so it's just so it obscures so much of what goes
Yeah.
on in there. So when you throw a guy like Donald Trump, who really like I would say he had a level of naivete walking in there, that he wins this election and he walks in there and he realizes that he is managing this giant complicated machine. He's supposedly managing this, he has authority
Yeah.
over it, this
Nominally.
highly complicated machine that's just wrapped in layers of secrecy, that is complicated, convoluted, that you have restrictions of information that can't even make it up even when he requests it, and he's trying to manage this. I mean, it's just incredible things were able to get done at all, in my opinion.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you even see this like with the military with him, where they were lying to him about troop levels in Syria. Like flat out, they said, nope, we don't have any troops there. And, oh, actually we have 20,000 or something like that. And they just flat out lied. And there are no consequences for it. What can he do? And you'll maybe have the people like now in the context of the primary that like back DeSantis or whatever. Well, you should have fired them. You should have fired them. But like what you're saying, I mean, you look at the example of JFK, you look at the example of Nixon. He knows that there's a line that he can cross where he's going to end up dead or he's going to end up gone, and in prison like now. And you even have, I mean, you have the memo during 2020 from General Milley saying that if he orders the troops to put down the riots, they'll coup him. They'll remove him from office. Like that's an extant memo that's real. It's not, made up, that they threatened these things to him. And so I think people have also, like generally speaking, have the same level of naivete about what the administrative state, what the so-called deep state is, and the power that it has. That if you are not aligned with it, if you're not a creature of Washington like Biden is, and many of the Republicans are, you're not going to be able to wield power. That's the reality. Even if you have this nominal power according to the Constitution that largely doesn't exist anymore, you're not able to wield it. So the people that think like, oh, well, if we elect Ron DeSantis and he gets in there, he's going to be able to clean things up. He'll be able to drain the swamp. And I think it's incredibly naive to think that, even if a man like DeSantis really is our guy and goes in there and begins to wage these battles and maneuver and so forth, he is also going to be limited in the exact same way, that he doesn't have he doesn't have power over them, even though he does on paper.
This brings up a really interesting point because, one of the things that you get a lot of pushback from like conservatives or classical liberals is like the extent to which because on paper the president is the head of the executive branch. All of the agencies, the bureaucracies, the departments, they all supposed to report to the president. He's in charge of them. They work at his permission and at his direction. In order to actually solve this problem, what you need is a president to exercise his actual New Deal given authority to put them into line and to put them in check, even to eliminate. He can eliminate, any president can eliminate departments. They can cut their funding. They can do whatever they want. It's perfectly in line with the New Deal's, power dynamics on paper. But if a president actually did that, he would be called anti-constitutional. He would be called a dictator. All these things. That's actually it's within his own power structure right now for the president to end the administrative state. Now, power exists in a realistic way beyond just how it does on paper. But that would not be a move of a dictator. It would actually be a move of a constitutional, purist. For him to do that, like that'd be completely legitimate, and yet that would be called dictatorship. The removal of power from all of these bureaucracies and departments, the legitimate removal of power from these things back into the presidency is both constitutional and consistent with the New Deal situation, and yet all of the conservatives and classical liberals and anti-woke, centrists, all of them would oppose it on the basis that it's dictatorial.
Yeah, so
That's
you can imagine. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you could imagine, like, say Donald Trump wins in 2024 and he takes office somehow, and he just fires all of the top level leadership of the FBI and doesn't replace them, just fires them all. Right? You can imagine the articles in National Review about how the president is a dictator and this is an attack on our democracy and all of this kind of stuff. When it's like, where did the FBI come from? It came from the Revolution of 1933. It came from the New Deal, and it didn't exist in the original constitutional order at all. And so, but they think that it's central to our government and all of it. It's so ludicrous. But yeah,
one
yeah,
something in there. I think that's a good point, because one of the things that I've been trying to, it's hard because you have to Americans, we've grown up in this, so it's really difficult to think outside of it. And it's been, I mean, in every new regime, and I use that term now, not like necessarily, I use it with a little venom sometimes, but like, let's just think of like this new order that has come out. We've all grown up with this. So, it's every regime is going to try to integrate the past, make it seem like this seamless progression that we're always getting better. We've watched this Bill on the Hill.
Yeah.
We have, talk about George Washington as if he would like come here and just preside over this system and recognize it, all this stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be honest, I'm a patriot. And what I mean by that is I'm bullish on America. I believe that this place is exceptional. I respect Moldbug's thoughts, for example, on kind of how we got here, but I don't think we need to. I believe that that where we came from was pretty incredible, and I believe that constitutional order is something that we need to reconcile with, but there are certain principles at play there that are very relevant still. What that means is the idea of having a kind of balance with a country of this size, with the culture that we come from, with where we started. Americans would like to have a sense of that popular consent back in their government. They still want the balance, because the founders and the people that came before that established this system of government were fairly conservative about doing so. They did not have, as opposed to contrary to the narrative that we all kind of inherited here, is that this was not a religious or spiritual, and I'm using that in a different term than maybe I would. It was not a sense to reform people spiritually. It was not to make them better souls. Okay. And what I mean by that, I'm not like going against, ancient philosophy. What I'm saying is it was not this progressive machine that on the other end, you would become more equitable, and you would be, you would let go of all your attachments to people, place, religion, all those kinds of things, come out on the other side, stripped of anything else. It was really trying to balance out the interests of people and factions and groups in so much that people would be able to retain a level of liberty while not having to be completely reformed by the state. And this is still relevant, I think, today. So if somebody were to come along, if a president were to actually try to flex those powers, what they can really focus on is the idea of like, these questions of liberty and tyranny that really gave rise to the American system of government are more relevant today than ever. Really, they're not irrelevant; they are relevant. People want to retain a level of liberty in the classical sense, because we're watching this same process go on in a way that it is becoming intolerable to people, because it's inside of your own home. Right? Like, we're not just talking about people that are angry about taxes alone. This is about the state trying to take your children and reform them and create them into a regime toady. We don't want this. Yeah. This violates something. Well, what does that violate? It violates something sacred. So these are the same questions that they were grappling with. I'm not arguing for a return, but like the idea is that why did legislative supremacy die in America? Why did it die? Where did it go? And the thing is, when you call these people out who are using the mantle of democracy, they have no good response to that. They
Yeah.
can't answer to this system. There's a level of dissonance between the two. That's where we should focus our energies on. I really
Yeah.
think that you press that and say, why is legislative supremacy gone? Why doesn't the president have control over the executive branch of government? Why do we have foreign policy crafted in think tanks and then just given to the powers that be and it gets implemented? There's
Yeah.
no check from the people on this. Isn't this contrary to the entire project? And I mean, really, like there's a level of legitimacy that we have in making those arguments. Because even if I can't
Yeah.
say that the system we have today is like wonderful and great, and there are flaws in the system that came before, yes, recognize that. Yes, maybe, we can talk about monarchy and all these other things. But really, when it comes down to it, when we talk about here and now, we have a legitimate case to be made. And I don't see why we don't make that case constantly, because they
Yes.
don't have a good response to this.
No.
I want to ask a question. So, there's two approaches to dealing with this situation. Like you have Paul Gottfried, he thinks there's basically no way of setting up a hopeful future unless you deal with the administrative state. He thinks the administrative state needs to be assaulted. He thinks it needs to be burned to the ground. That's kind of his instinct. Whereas you would have someone like Adrian Vermeule, who basically wants to sanctify the administrative state and use it for his purposes. Which, I mean, do you have any other alternative, or do you have like some sort of instinct on that debate?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's interesting. That's a great juxtaposition between those two individuals. Vermeule, I have no issues with him. I find his content interesting. I mean, he recently unfollowed me, so it might be because of this. Because I do side more with Paul Gottfried on this position. I don't think. I think the story of the 20th century is every president who recognizes problems with the administrative state trying to either grab it and to put it under his thumb and try to control it, right? This really difficult, incomprehensible system, or they try to imbue it with a spirit, right? And we saw this in the 60s. I mean, really, like, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a spiritual reawakening in people. I'm not saying it's a good spirit necessarily, but a spiritual reawakening that came about in the 1960s. And it has been completely, like, our administrative state has been imbued with this spirit, and it's
Right.
evolved, right? Like, why are we talking about strange concepts like like, why do these people sound like communists from the 50s? Like, they sound exactly the same. Like, why is that?
Yeah.
Well, we've tried to imbue the spirit into the administrative state. I don't think these things are good. I think that really returning back to those original questions, and I'm not saying we have to arrive at the same place that the founders did. We are a different people. This is a different time. So there's some major differences there. But these same questions that they were asking to me, are way more important to focus on than trying to come in and tinker with this machine and make it work for us, because we've tried that for 100 years and it has
Yeah.
not worked. So I'm with Godfrey that I think that a president should use his constitutional authority
Right.
to rein this thing in. And when I say rein, I mean it needs to be whittled down to a nub of what it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which would
Yeah.
be considered authoritarian and tyrannical. And it's just funny because you're literally removing power from the greatest enemy that America has had in its own soil, and that's the problem. That's the tyranny. It's amazing how people are thinking about this dynamic so backwards.
Yeah. One thing I want to get back to is some of the history and unpack it a little bit more. I mean, we've only just touched on it. It seems like. I mean, you mentioned like foreign policy being totally outside of popular sovereignty, and you see this with World War in like the election in 1940, Roosevelt's second reelection. He ran on keeping the United States out of the Second World War. Like that was his main theme of his election was we're not going to go to war. We're not going to be in a foreign war. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he's doing everything he can to get the United States into the Second World War. And so, I mean, that's part. I mean, that's also where the genesis of of how foreign policy is conducted in America, where the people have absolutely no say. And even more so now, you have mass media that is able to manipulate people into believing whatever the regime wants with regard to foreign policy, to think that, today it's in America's national interest for there to be this war in the Donbass, that it's so important that America is involved in. And so, like, you see that. I mean, how pivotal, I guess maybe it's an understatement to ask it this way, but how pivotal is America's entry into World War II within the paradigm of the New Deal revolution, and in the formation of the American regime, the American uniparty? Like, how central is that?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, this it's really interesting because I mean, I as as a bystander, right, and looking at history, it's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating to dig into this and to see what perceptions among the public, the American public, was prior to the war, during the war,
Yeah.
after the war, and to see how the Americans viewed themselves, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
we were never. I mean, America was never much. I mean, people use it all the time. I don't like the term imperialism, but it's like
Yeah.
there were obviously America was more than willing to go to the mat in its sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine is
Mm-hmm.
real, and these things. But at the same time, America was not a world empire as we
No.
understand it today. This was a huge cultural shift for Americans who, the expansionist idea, this is very much rooted in like the frontier, not necessarily like going to the other end of the world. What Americans pulled off in World War II is nothing short of incredible. I never, people love to like dog on the United States, how we conducted the war, and there are many problems. Like I
Mm-hmm.
recognize that, but it's nothing short of incredible what Americans pulled off. Really, like if you
Yeah.
just take it
Absolutely.
out and pull your emotions out of it, it's phenomenal. And like just because we allowed the Soviets to really like fight off, the Germans during for the bulk of it, like that's to me that's a huge win. That's not necessarily like I don't think sacrificing lots of Americans against Germany when we have another problem in the Pacific is like wise. So like people try to use
Mm-hmm.
that to dog on the American. Like that's just stupid to me. But
Mm-hmm.
like at the same time, what happens during this? Well, like you're right. This Americans aren't really wanting to go to war, and the isolationist smears come out, right? And you have the American First Committee, which is these guys are all mostly like World War I veterans. They know what's up.
Yeah.
They know exactly
Yeah.
what's going on. They see this war mobilization effort, and they see a big problem. They do not want a repeat, even bigger this time, of what they already went through and saw. And the shenanigans, the war profiteering, all this kind of stuff that was going on during World War I. It was a major scandal in American society at the time. There was a real like pall over the whole thing. So like people have that memory still. Many of these guys were over there. They saw the bad things. They saw the failures. It was a disaster, and the progressives, like because it was a disaster, kind of turned their venom against regular Americans for not like celebrating the project.
Mm-hmm.
And so like
Mm-hmm.
this kind of anger, reactionary anger, is like building within where you guys are from. I mean, we're really like, well, I'm not exactly sure where you're from, CJ, but I know you talked about Minnesota and this. I mean, this is like really
Yeah.
where you get this huge movement. A lot of these like farmer types, right? Like people, it's huge over there. America First blows up in these places because
Mm-hmm.
they want to stay out of the war, right? But you're right. FDR is able to mobilize in his war effort. It's very important to him. And what's interesting is like this is where you start to see the growth of what we would call like the security state. Prior to the dropping of the bomb and all that, and communist infiltration, is you have people that have legitimate concerns about this, and they rally around the America First committee, right? And what happens is FDR, Hoover was always like Hoover. I would say Hoover was a true blue like American. He was not a
Mm-hmm.
communist or anything like that. But Hoover's first and foremost priority was to enlarge the FBI, to give it more power. He had dirt
Mm-hmm.
on lots and lots of people on both parties, right? He was probably more Republican minded, but he was a creature of this institution. And
Yeah.
you know, when FDR is starting to see that there's this reaction that people are kind of starting to catch on to what's happening and they're being very critical about it, And they're writing him letters, right? They're writing him letters saying, please don't do this. Like, I just saw, the war mobilization. Like, I think we don't want to go to war, yada, yada. And he hands those telegrams over to the FBI, and the FBI starts looking into all those names of these little old ladies and people that are sending letters. And
Mm-hmm.
he starts sending the FBI to go and like take license plates take down license plates at these America First rallies where they're giving speeches about the war. These veterans are coming out. And then in token with that is that these files that the FBI is collecting on people that are opposed to the war are suddenly falling in the hands of friendly journalists that are smearing these people, that are making it sound like there's a second Brown, there's a Brown scare on the horizon. These people are fascist. Yeah. Many of these people, there were people that were sympathetic to fascism within the movement, just like you have with anything. But like there were people within FDR's administration that were sympathetic to fascism. People don't realize that. So like, this was it was like this other thing that was going on. So of course you're going to have some people, and you had some weirdos in the group, but really they didn't. I mean, everything I've dug into it, they didn't really define the organization. There were communists in America First. Like people don't get this. It's like it was primarily an issue oriented about not going to war. So people all had their own reasons. But FDR was very effective at using intelligence capabilities alongside journalism to destroy this movement. And it was still very robust up until Pearl Harbor. I mean, it was very, very strong. And you had people you had guys like John T. Flynn. You had, you had a lot of these old timers that had been through and watched this transformation, were critical of the way that FDR was accruing power and the lies he was telling, because they were, and they would write articles about this, and the administration would call and get these guys fired from their jobs. Like he would call a newspaper and they'd fire this journalist for criticism. I mean, all these things that are so commonplace today. This was kind of a new thing, and this was happening because of the war. You're right. The Roosevelt administration very much wanted to mobilize for war. Now, whether or not they wanted to go to war, I tend to believe that FDR definitely wanted to go to war, and he made it so that we would eventually go to war or get very, very close to it. That's my opinion. Some people do not like to hear that, but I think that if you dig into the evidence, it's abundantly clear that this was kind of in the works for a very long time. Very similar in my mind is 9/11 happened. There were plans and interests in trying to go into Iraq, and they were finally given the light of day. So like this is kind of how politics works. Is sometimes you hold your cards for a while, you have a game plan, you have your interests, and then once the stars align, you shoot your shot.
Yeah. Have you read Charles Tansel's Back Door to War? It's like 600 pages, and he just went through the entire archives, all the State Department data. Have you read that book?
No, I need to add that to my list. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. Basically, I think it's a pretty dispositive case that he makes that just demonstrates they were entirely gung-ho about going to war, that the plan was war, and everything they say publicly was the opposite of what they're doing within the State Department and within the foreign policy apparatus as it existed. And you see this today. I mean, like the FBI basically doxing people and getting them fired and all of this. It's like that the exact same thing is what they do today. It is no different. It's only just expanded, and they have more technological capability and so forth. That's what they do. They're not as shrewd of operators as FDR was. They kind of have been handed the system that he's been given, but they're not nearly at his level of ability.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that too is that you talked about the smearing and stuff, and this he was really good at this, and we do it now. It's like commonplace, right? What's really interesting though is that the level of the tools, the propaganda tools that existed at that time were just like during this. You have radio. All of a sudden, you have newspapers are huge. They wield power in a way that they weren't as effective before, and they start to because one thing I didn't say before, but like once FDR ushered in, this New Deal program, it's kind of the age of professors. So like these educated, egghead types that maybe in American society before that, like, some strapping farmer from Iowa would kind of be like, yeah, that guy's a nerd, like really essentially at the time. And they gain a level of prestige through Wilson, but into FDR especially, that is much higher. And now they have like a regime foothold, and they
Mhm.
they go crazy. And like during the New Deal, they're just like going all over the place, trying this, trying that. Things fail,
Mhm.
some things work. It's very haphazard. It's all over the place. But the level of prestige that these types get goes up. At the same time, journalism and radio, the level of prestige starts to increase, where there's, and you see the
Mhm.
official relationship, that this is more of like,
Mhm.
we now look at the newspapers and we look at these and radio programs as official. Like this is coming from official sources, and they have this, all the yellow journalism kind of thing kind of starts to like leak out and die, unless you're like a anti-communist on the right. Now you're still associated with that, kind of that stain. But what's interesting is all that smearing, and they had their own show trials at this time too. They had all this
Mhm.
stuff going on, but it create and this, as we're propping up the Soviet Union, as we're bending over backwards for the Soviet Union, and in the process being
Mhm.
infiltrated by communist, by these communist agents and so on. Like
Yes.
there's building anger in the heartland. There's all these
Yeah.
people that were maybe against the war. They don't like communism. They don't like how this program has no checks and balances. They don't like how they don't have a voice. Nobody in the newspapers listens to these people, but there's millions. They're probably the bulk. Like,
Mhm.
they're really like the backbone. This is like the beginning of the silent majority. These
Yeah.
people are angry, and suddenly, when this regime finds itself in a pickle, when Truman comes along, then now you have this explosion of anti-communist energy, which is very much built on
Yeah.
the resentment developed up during the time of FDR. This is where you get McCarthy, and it just
Yeah.
blows up. And so it's this really fascinating thing where it's like a pressure cooker, and it expresses itself later in anti-communism.
Yeah, that leads me to the next thing, and really one place I really wanted to go. And hopefully we have enough time for it. We're almost out of time here, and it's almost like, oh, we almost need another episode just on McCarthyism in general. Um, is why did it fail, right? Why didn't McCarthy? I mean, I think maybe you don't think it failed, but I think it did. It didn't root out the communists in the system, that didn't dismantle the administrative state. I mean, maybe that's why it failed. Is you just have a handful of people in Congress that are fighting it, and but the entire apparatus still exists. So what are your thoughts there?
Oh man, I have many thoughts. I'll try to keep it. I know I'm sorry about all the monologuing. I can't.
No, this is
But
what we pay you for. This.
um, oh man, I could. Communism, the influence of communism in America is just like one of the most fascinating things.
Yeah.
And I really think it helps to us to understand the present, not because like we don't have Soviet KGB agents like
No.
lurking in the administrative state today. We don't, but we have the strange, deformed, like offspring of these of this infiltrative action, the subversive
Mhm.
action, still today, and it's very much a real thing. And so,
Yeah.
like, there's a reason why I can walk around with a copy of the Communist Manifesto and nobody will care. There's a reason why I could wear a Che Guevara shirt, and I might get some like guy like me, some like chud type, might yell at
Yeah.
me, but
Yeah.
like I'm not gonna lose my job, right?
No.
Like, interesting, right? I mean, it's just fascinating given the history of the 20th century and the death and
Yeah.
despair and the horrible things that have happened, which we are very much easy to access. Like, why is this not a cultural taboo? Okay. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
going with that is, during this time, as we talked about the world globalization, the Roosevelt administration was, I mean, the Lend Lease is a really fascinating thing. I mean, you want to talk
Hmm.
about winning a war. One of the reasons we won the war is because of Lend Lease. Whether or not you
Yeah.
think that's a good thing, I don't really care. That's not what I'm saying. It's just, if you look at
Yeah.
this just on scoreboard, it was a very effective program in propping up the Soviet Union and keeping them in the game. They would not have been in the
Mhm.
game the whole war if they did not have the United States propping them up. And when I say propping them up, they were propping them up.
Like
This
literally.
was
Yeah.
literally, I mean, we were giving them a level of muscle that they did not have and could not have survived without. And that needs to be addressed. People tend to ignore that, but that was a very effective and important thing to keep the Soviet Union in the game. Now, why did the United States feel more cozied up to the Soviet Union than maybe like, the Axis at the time, right? Given that, like, let's go back and let's kind of peel back the history and go back to the original source. Fascism and communism were things that were still being like debated about at the beginning of this whole thing, like in the 20s and into the 30s. It did not have this like dirty word thing to either of them. Well, there was, but it wasn't like this strong taboo that
like
we have
today.
Right. It was very different. Like, you could be a educated person and talk about this, but let's be honest, like most educated people that were also uplifted by the New Deal, right, that had a level of prominence and prestige, were very sympathetic to communism, because it was viewed, like, we have to remember that, like, at the beginning of this whole thing with the Bolshevik Revolution, like, the left in America was on the ropes. I mean, they had not won anything. They had nothing to hang their hat on. And when you have Lenin rise and, over in Russia, suddenly for the first time, like, a left-wing project actually has, it's embodied somewhere. And it's not just embodied in a small way. It is a winner, right? And they look at this, and this just changes the culture of the left in the United States overnight, right? Like, gone are the days of like the farmer populists and bimetallism, and I mean, all those things get New Deal, but like Bolshevism, communism is suddenly like it is a real thing. It is something that that the left sees as, we can't be in this middle ground. Socialism was like totally fine in the United States. Like, people were socialists, and it was not a big deal back then. And so it was like, well, we're in this middle ground of socialism. Communism comes along, and it's like, we can't be in this limbo anymore. We either got to go like all in, or we got to just hang on to this sinking ship. And they really believed. I mean, people of both, of like conservative types, and I mean, it looked like capitalism was failing. Like, there was a long history of antitrust and of like have like all these like difficult things that people didn't really feel good about. Like this like, there were failures that people of either, like, all stripes could see and had problems with. And so there was a lot of educated people who could latch onto something like communism and see that this is prophetic. Like, this is the course of history. There's a system, a scientificness about this. It was very much oriented around science. Well, what's the New Deal? It's really like a pseudo scientific approach to managing a country, to managing government, to managing society in a way, to reforming society. Communism is reforming society elsewhere. Fascism is kind of a response to communism, but is also restructuring society. All of this in the aftermath of war. The United States is undergoing its own transformation as it's trying to manage things scientifically. It's a natural bedfellow to communism. It really is.
Yeah.
There's intellectuals in America, professors, where they're convinced that communism is the future. They really are. Like, already before that, it was socialism's the future. Well, communism now looks more realistic, right? And so one thing I'll just kind of address here real quick as I touch on the communism thing is, Whittaker Chambers, in his book Witness, it's very good. He has a line, he has like a brief paragraph in there where he was for those of who haven't read it, he was a communist agent who was working clandestinely in the United States. He's American, right? But he's working for the Soviet Union, essentially spying, running spy rings, doing all sorts of things like that. He's directly involved with spy rings that are operating within the administrative state in Washington. And he writes this memoir after he comes out and burns Alger Hiss, and there's the trial and all that. But he talks about how the New Deal was it was like a superficial reform movement. But like, it wasn't like it was superficial on the outside, because underneath it was a genuine revolution. Like, that this was a real revolution against existing traditions, like we talked about, the constitutional order. But it wasn't a revolution of violence like it was in the Soviet Union. This was like a revolution of bookkeeping and lawmaking. And that one of the things he remarks on is that many of the people within the new dealers inside the administrative state were not able to recognize communists in their midst, like true blue, card carrying and working for the Soviet Union communists. They couldn't see them. They were invisible to many of them. And why is that? And he would say that because these were revolutionists looking at other revolutionists. Okay. And I think that that's the important part to hold on to, because During this time, as America's mobilizing for war, they've already been mobilized economically. They're now mobilized for a world war, right? And it's against
Yeah.
fascism. This buoys this communist contingent within the United States. And there's a popular front which unites, these liberals within government alongside with actual card-carrying communists. And at this time, the Communist Party of America is being directly funded, getting their marching orders directly from Moscow. Their leadership is selected by Moscow.
Yes.
Soviet agents that are infiltrating the United States, subverting organizations, but also infiltrating the U.S. government. They're getting their marching orders from Moscow, and they're directly recruiting from the Communist Party of America. So while you might have like some little lady in the Communist Party who does not work for the Soviets, but she believes, communism is the future and whatever, these agents and recruiters are going to these meetings and they're pulling people and they're pulling them into the apparatus of spying. And this is happening it's happening all over the country, from San Francisco all the way to the United States. And this goes on for years, and it is under the cover of the war. Some of the people that are involved in these spying activities are at the top of the U.S. Treasury, a very powerful institution today, but very powerful back then. Like, we have to realize that this is second guy in command of the Treasury, of U.S. Treasury, is a card-carrying communist taking his orders from Moscow. Okay, making decisions. He is the architect. Like, this person I'm talking about, Harry Dexter White, is the architect of later of the IMF, of these other global organizations that we all recognize today. He is a card-carrying communist. Alger Hiss within the State Department, very powerful, instrumental in setting up the UN. He's also a card-carrying communist, right? And you go down the list. And so what happens is this embeds itself. It's involved in our intelligence. The Pentagon has a huge problem with this. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA, there is a massive infiltration of communist agents within the OSS that even the private advisor to the head of the OSS is a card-carrying communist and passing information to Moscow. An advisor to FDR is a card-carrying communist, privy to many sensitive conversations. Yeah. The Soviets in this milieu knew about the bomb before Truman did. They knew about the Manhattan Project before Truman did, and he was the vice president at this time. There were decisions where FDR would go to the table to negotiate with Stalin, and Stalin would already know many of the things that FDR was coming there to privately tell him. Okay, this is the problem that has festered, and there's people within the country that are understanding things are going on. Patton was one of those who knew something weird was going on. He knew that he couldn't trust the intelligence sometimes because he was worried it was getting leaked to the Soviets, right? He didn't trust them with the cowboy types that were in there working with so closely with the Soviets. Other people within government felt this way too. And what you have this building anger and resentment of noticing problems that are not being addressed. And those who would bring them up are being called disloyal or smeared as fascists. And it comes roaring into focus in the late 40s and early 50s. And from there, you have the rise of McCarthy. Sorry, that was a huge rambling monologue.
No. Excellent stuff. And it's, we're almost out of time. I know CJ has to get going. I saw him, typing. He's probably emailing the people that he has to meet with next. No.
You're fine. I had one last. I told him I'd be 10 more minutes. Talking with very important people, but I have one more question that I wanted to slip in there. This is a fun one, but in your opinion, do you think Woodrow Wilson and the progressive movement or FDR and the managerial revolution was more devastating to the course of America? And I know these are kind of related, the two movements, one fed off the other, but if you could pinpoint one as being more, worse, more damaging, and more destructive, who would you point to?
I'm going to have to be boring and go with FDR still. I think Wilson really kind of had that. It was a spiritual attack on the Constitution and on constitutional order. FDR was the real deal muscle attack. This is where things we had been primed for this probably through Wilson, but the nail was driven by FDR.
Yeah.
There
That's
you go. There you go.
I have to agree with that. You're definitely right. And you set up the McCarthyism and the communist infiltration and all of that, and it's almost like we need to do a whole nother episode just on that. So maybe you'll have to come back for part 2. Maybe next week. I don't know what your schedule looks like, but I would love it if you could, and you keep going with this, because this is all fascinating stuff, and it's all the kind of stuff that is withheld from us, right? We're told about McCarthy and the Red Scare and all of this as though it was bad, as though they're looking for communists under every rock, and it was all fake, like it was a boogeyman. It was very, very real. I mean, you see this. I don't know if I mentioned your review of the Oppenheimer film, but you see this even in that movie. And I didn't read I waited to read your review until I saw the movie, and I'm like, I agree with this 100%. You're absolutely right. I had the same perspective on the film, where they address it, but it's almost kind of dismissed. It's almost kind of like, well, that's just what people were doing in those days. They all, of course they were all communists. That's just the way it was. And the evil, the evil fascists in the government are smearing this guy. I think, if we could spend an entire hour just talking about that film and that context, the McCarthyism. I mean, just the production of the nuclear bomb and the Manhattan Project, and just how many communists were involved in it, or fellow travelers at least. It is this fascinating period of American history, and it really does echo to the current day. Like you said, it's not as though the people running things are these are literal communists, that they've read Marx, or they're Lenin, they understand Lenin and Bolshevism or any of this. They're kind of these mongrelized hybrids, several generations back, that are downstream of it, and we're living in light of it today. So yeah, I'd love it if you could come back and unpack some of this even more. I don't know. We'll have to discuss off air what that would look like. But anything else? We're going to link to all of to your Substack and to and to everywhere else you write. But yeah, any parting words as we close up the episode here?
Yeah, I'll keep these short. I appreciate all your patience. I could talk. I mean, I love this subject, so I could talk about it forever.
I know.
My wife hates when I get on, if she brings up this period at all. She's ready to put on the earmuffs because she gets so tired of hearing about it. But so I appreciate you guys being my audience over here. Everybody's turned against me in my house, but I'll say I would love to come back on and talk about this. I think people, I think people need to understand something is when you start digging into this, it's really easy. Like we say, black pill, people will read this and they'll just be blown away. Because partially, you've been drinking milk since you were a child, and now there's this big, nasty, dirt, rotting piece of meat you're being forced to eat. And it's hard.
Yeah.
I said, I'm still a patriot, folks. I love this country. I love America. I love Americans. And I'm proud also of what we've done, even if there's grander, there are problems, there's devil's detail. Yes, I get that. But I'm proud to say that I'm proud of the boys that went over and fought. I'm proud of the American people for what they've tolerated from their government for many years. I love this country and I want us to succeed. In our interactions with communism, it's kind of dialectical here, is there's always an exchange. We were influenced by them and they were influenced by us. And the influence that we exchanged to them destroyed the Soviet Union eventually. Very interesting history there. But we're still standing here. We've been tainted by things. We've gone through some difficult things. We have a problem on our hands. We all see this. But I'm bullish on America. I'm bullish on Americans. We've been through a lot, but there's something special about this place. There's something special about us. And I think we can't forget that as we go through this. Yeah. Sometimes we have to kind of have a little funeral for things. We bury it and we hold on to the burning embers that still have light and heat. I still think we have many things like that to hold on to and carry forward, because where we're going in the future, there will be another transformation. I want the good things that have maybe fallen by the wayside, that precede this epic transformation that we encountered in the beginning of the 20th century. I want to see some of these things get addressed and fixed. And I think we have an opportunity to inject good creative things to grapple with the present, to retain our sense of who we are, to keep our souls, to keep God in our lives. Like these things, this is what we should fight for because the changes are happening. And I'll just say the last thing is, if anybody's interested, I've got a Substack, ruins.substack.com. I'm analyzing Apocalypse Now. If that is interesting to you, Vietnam War, diving into that and the themes there. And then you can always find me over at I am 1776. So thank you for your time, guys. I'm sorry to harangue you so long, but I appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for joining us. This is, one of the best episodes we've ever done. I'll speak for CJ in saying that. And I'm so glad you could join us. I hope you can join us again very soon to keep on discussing this. And for CJ, for me, thank you all for listening, and stay dangerous, and we will see you next time.